President and CEO of the Association of Community College Trustees, a not-for-profit educational organization that represents governing boards and more than 6,500 elected and appointed officials who govern our nation's community, technical, and junior colleges throughout the United States. On behalf of my partners, Rob Anderson with the State Higher Education Executive Officers Organization and Matt Gandel of the Education Strategy Group, I welcome you to our Making a Comeback webinar series. Our three organizations are acutely aware of the tremendous stress that our higher education systems and institutions are facing due to the effects of the COVID pandemic. Especially the health and safety challenges are compounded by severe effects of now our deepening economic recession. We are offering this webinar series to arm leaders around the country with strategies for positioning post-secondary education as an engine to accelerate the recovery. Our previous webinars focused on planning for a changing labor market in light of COVID-19 and addressing the urgent needs of the pipeline from K-12. These are posted on the Education Strategy Group website if you'd like to view them. Today's topic is about contingency planning for the fall. While post-secondary credentials increase in importance, the uncertainties around COVID-19 have made it very difficult to plan around opening of the fall, and enrollment is now harder to predict. Given these uncertainties, our panel will discuss the perspectives on planning and options for the fall. Our panel consists of three different leaders from three different structures. I'm very pleased to be joined this afternoon by three colleagues from the field who can speak directly to the issues this afternoon. First, I'm pleased to welcome Dan Greenstein, who is the Chancellor of the Pennsylvania State System of Higher Education. Welcome, Dan. Followed also Jan Yoshiwara, who is the Executive Director of the Washington State Board for Community and Technical Colleges. Welcome to you, Jan. And then finally, Anton Reece, who is the President of Western Kentucky Community College in Paducah, Kentucky. And welcome to you, Anton. Thank you so much for being with me this afternoon. Now, before we get started, just a couple of quick housekeeping details. We're going to have a discussion with the panelists for about 35 minutes or so on the topic, and then we're going to try and turn to questions that you, the audience, will be posing. Those questions will be fed to me, and I will attempt to get those before the panelists in the time that we have. The chat feature will be shut off for participants. Please use the Q&A tab only on the toolbar to submit a question. Because we are a very large group, we're not going to be able to get through every single question that people may ask. Also, for best viewing, please set your option to gallery view if it's not already set to that. And finally, the webinar will be recorded and a link will be provided to all participants. Please follow along on Twitter using hashtag #MakingAComeback. And with that, let's get started. So to my colleagues, I'm going to kick this off with a general question for all three of you. We've seen a wide range of signals and debate among our higher education leaders related to opening this fall. Some are talking about opening in the fall fully. Some are announcing their intention to stick to only online classes this fall. And some are suggesting some type of blended or hybrid approach for the fall. And many more are still making decisions based on what they're learning and have not made final determination. Can I ask each of you to kind of weigh in on your views about the fall? What decisions, if any, have been made yet? And how are you getting to that decision point? And I guess, Dan, I'll start with you, and then Jan, and then Anton.
That's great. Thanks, Noah. Can you hear me? Just a quick sound check.
I hear you loud and clear, Dan.
That's great. So yeah, obviously, I think across higher education, I think everybody will speak to that. People have been working pretty assiduously, diligently on their plans for re-engaging with face-to-face instruction in the fall. I think it's important for us to say it's not like we're reopening, because I don't think any of us were ever shut. We're just moved into a remote environment. I can tell you about what's happening in Pennsylvania and the critical components of what's going on here. One of them has been the development by the Pennsylvania Department of Education, obviously with the Commonwealth and the Pennsylvania Department of Health, developing a set of guidelines. They were just released today. They make certain requirements of universities for developing plans for remote for re-engaging face-to-face instruction, and they provide a bunch of best practice guidelines. In my view, appropriately, they accommodate a diversity of responses. Our universities are incredibly different in terms of where they're situated, in what parts of the state, what kinds of communities they serve, et cetera. And so what's interesting to me is to watch the presidents in my organization and across the state, the leaders of higher education, really working within those guidelines in order to do two things: to serve their communities and their students in a way that's entirely appropriate, given their location, the work that they do, the kind of education that they offer, ensuring that their students can continue making progress towards their degree, all of their students, so there's a strong equity component, while doing everything they can to mitigate health and safety risk. And that looks different at every university and every college. And I have to say, I've in some ways been inspired by the level of creativity I see emerging from leadership across higher education, not just in my system of our 14 universities, but really across the state. So those are the kind of critical components: the framework, which provides some guidelines, the aggregation of recommendations with respect to approaches to social distancing and health and safety measures, et cetera. And then really the assiduous and analytically driven creativity that presidents have to go through with their local constituencies to work out what's the best plan for them in the fall.
Okay, thank you, Dan. Jan, do you want to follow?
Sure. So we have kind of an interesting situation here in Washington. As Dan said, our community and technical colleges never closed. We moved instruction and services online. And then we have been slowly bringing some face-to-face instruction back to campus since May 5th. And so there are certain kinds of instructions, as all of you know, in the community college world, that can't be delivered online. And so those are largely the lab and practicum hands-on components of programs that are primarily in the technical education arena, but also science labs. And so we began negotiating with the governor's office, the Department of Health here in Washington, to bring back lab and practicum instruction only in programs that were tied to essential occupations. So when our governor issued the stay home order, there was a long list of occupations and businesses that were essential to the economy that stayed open. Healthcare is an obvious example. And so we got permission with a long 6-page list of health and safety protocols that were conditions for reopening those classes. So in a way, our colleges have already been working on trying to figure out how to implement these safety protocols in order to reopen those classes. And there are more of them that are going to be open for summer quarter starting at the end of June, because we got a second round of permissions to open up some additional hands-on and lab courses. So our colleges are already in a hybrid mode of offering the bulk of instruction online and offering some hands-on face-to-face with a much smaller number of students on campus. So I think that when we talk about fall, that our colleges are planning to do a similar hybrid approach. And everyone has said they are going to be offering more online classes than what they offered last fall. Lots of our colleges are planning to have hybrid courses or classes, so that classes that meet partially online and partially in the classroom a couple of days a week, as a way of hedging bets that in case there is a resurgence of the virus and we have to go back to a predominantly online mode, that we will be prepared for that. All the learning management systems and classroom spaces will have been set up for the faculty and for the students, and so we can quickly pivot to an online mode. We are using these opportunities that we've been given to start to reopen certain classes to learn about what the safety protocols are that have to be in place in order to do that more broadly for fall quarter.
Okay, thanks. And then Anton.
Thanks, Noah. And let me just say, I didn't hear you. let me just say good afternoon to everyone, and definitely appreciative to be part of this very important conversation amidst all things COVID-19 and certainly all that's happening nationally. As my colleagues mentioned, we too have been preparing under the CDC guidelines. Our governor in Kentucky, one of 16 colleges in the Kentucky Community Technical College system. And so there's a series of directives and planning through phases, throughout June, July, and certainly August, which gives us an opportunity to incrementally bring students back, get staff and faculty acclimated in preparation for the fall, like everyone else, where we too are looking at 3 scenarios: face-to-face, hybrid, or fully online. So we feel pretty prepared in some ways as we approach the uncertainty of the fall.
Okay, thank you. I know, Jan, you mentioned some of these, but Dan and Anton, are there certain conditions that you feel would need to be met in order to make the transition successfully and ensure the safety and health of students and faculty?
So let me jump on that if I can, because when all is said and done, safety is really the key marker, I think, in all of our conversations. And a drill down on that is, it is important. Certainly I have found in my 15 colleagues serving their respective colleges, the importance of our students, campus community, stakeholders, that they hear from the president. I think they really want to hear from the president some measure of assurance that we have safety fully in our sights. And so that underscores then the importance of, in my case, I start off really with daily updates with all things COVID, particularly as the phases have evolved, and now weekly updates, as examples around safety. The other part of that too is that we have to be sure, to the best of our ability, and I do it through, like several of my colleagues, walk arounds. I mean, we're really going and looking at the infrastructure of the buildings, the signage, et cetera, because the infrastructure, when all is said and done, is probably going to be the biggest seller, particularly if we go face to face. Students, parents, and general public, I think the moment that they enter campus, they want to see some visibility and ways in which we are highlighting and practicing effective social distancing.
And you're on mute, so.
Sorry, story of my life. Just a couple things. One of them is I want to be careful with language, and I want to be careful being careful with language. None of us can ensure safety. We can mitigate risk, and we need to, and we have to. And to Anton's point, that is 158% front and center for all of us in higher ed, trying to do everything we can to mitigate risk. And we need to do that. The guidelines that we're getting and which are beginning to coalesce consensus around, key aspects of risk mitigation, mask wearing, social distancing, routine cleaning of high-use sites, traffic flow, minimizing the number of people that gather in any one place, putting up PPE and barriers between people who are involved in transactional work. All that stuff is super important. And so as those guidelines coalesce, they provide, some good guardrails for higher ed leaders to think about as they plan what their re-engagement and face-to-face looks like. That's important. I think there's a couple of other components that I would call out. One of them is that our students and our employees also have a role to play here. We have to be absolutely crystal clear about what our expectations are of ourselves as institutions, we will do everything we can to mitigate risk, but also of our students and faculty. Wearing a mask is not, and in my view, personally, should not be optional. Yes, we have to make exceptions for people who have, certain disabilities or have other reasons they can't wear a mask. That's definitely true. Social distancing is not an option. And so I think we need to be clear with our employees, just as we're being clear with our students and the public about what we as institutions are doing to mitigate the risks that are there as a result of this pandemic. We have to engage our employees and our students in a dialogue about their roles and our expectations of their roles and what we were going to do. And then the third thing I guess I would mention really goes to this issue of sort of contact tracing and testing. It's critical, right? So we can identify a COVID positive case, a student or employee at one of our universities or colleges, and we know that we have a sick individual and we need to help that individual and take all the necessary steps that we would take when we identify a COVID-19 positive test. The question, though, beyond that is what's the level of community spread within our community? And how do we know? What is that one case or those two cases? What does that tell us about what's currently within our community? And the only way that I know of that you can do that is through some form of testing. And testing is something, nationally, we've taken a free market approach to testing. And as a consequence, it's going to be something which is very, very difficult for individual universities and colleges to arrange for on their own in a way that would provide the scale of effort that would be necessary to return meaningful results. This is an area where I know higher education is working with leadership at state and federal levels to really find support for that critical mechanism without which we're kind of flying blind on some basic issues about the level of infection within our communities.
Thank you. That's interesting, Jan. Yeah, could you, what's the conversation and thinking in Washington State?
Yeah, so I was just going to add a few things. So I think the challenge for us is that there's certain things that we can step up and control, and there are certain things that we can't control. So in the community and technical college sector, here in our state, because we are bringing students back to campus, our colleges are developing really short back to campus safety protocol videos for students to view before they start class. And so it goes to the responsibility issue that I think that we want to communicate to all of our faculty and staff who come back on campus, and students that come back on campus. And so there's been a lot of sharing of those videos among our campuses. Secondly is that we are really, contact tracing is something we think we can do. So we have worked with the Department of Health to develop a curriculum on contact tracing that they endorse. And our plan is to make that available to every college, to train campus teams on how to do contact tracing within the institution. And I think that does a couple of things. One is it communicates to people the importance of things like keeping track of who goes in and out of each classroom, and why is that important from a contact tracing standpoint. And it also helps prepare our institutions for the inevitable case that is going to show up on campus when we bring thousands of students back to our institutions. And the other piece that we want to do is to integrate that contact tracing into our healthcare programs, so that we are graduating people who can help support contact tracing capacity in their own communities. And we know that we have very diverse student bodies, more diverse than what exists in local communities. And so we want to make a positive contribution to people who are trusted messengers in their communities, to be able to help do the contact tracing that's going to be needed in every sector of local communities. The part that we cannot control is the testing. So our colleges are commuter institutions. We don't have health centers. We don't have people on campuses other than maybe their nursing faculty who have the skill set to be able to collect samples, much less to actually analyze the samples and to do the testing. So we are our institutions are very heavily reliant upon the local health departments and the hospitals to do that testing. And so that's part of the conversation between our colleges and their local healthcare providers, is how are we going to be able to do that testing, because our institutions can't do that themselves. And so right now, that's one of the critical factors, I think, in a safe return, is setting up, making those arrangements for how are we going to be able to test people.
Let me just, for 30 seconds, just add on top of that, because you bring up a lot of very important points, that in the absence of that ability to do that testing, part of our contact tracing also involves where every employee, staff must do a daily check-in. So we go through safe colleges, use that video, but then there's a short series of questions all tied to temperature checks, those sort of things, so that we at least have some initial documentation, and then have individuals to record who they come in contact with, for expanded periods of time, if they come within that 6 feet barrier. Not perfect, obviously, but just another way that we try to show some awareness of that safety. And then in order to enter the buildings, we have sign-ins that will be required, which is going to be a little laborious, but in lieu to being able to have that degree of testing, as mentioned, these are just some other ways that we try to, again, preserve safety to the best of our ability.
Okay. Let's talk about the fall now. So I hear markedly different things from colleagues about the projection for fall enrollment. I hear some leaders say that they're expecting to see an increase in enrollment. I hear others say that it'll be flat, and still others say that it'll be way down. When you think about the uncertainties around enrollment, coupled with what we know is happening in the states in terms of severe and probably sustained budget cutbacks, how do you approach planning for this fall in terms of courses, faculty loads, and all the rest of it? Who wants to take a run at that first?
I'll jump in if nobody else.
Oh, good. I was hoping somebody would.
So, it's so funny that I feel like we're back in 2008-9, where during the Great Recession, those numbers that we all look at and know and love, applications, admits, deposits, et cetera, we continue to look at them and where we were this time last year, and we'll continue to look at them this year. But they seem to lose in a moment like this any predictive value they ever had, because there are so many things you just don't know. We're all of our universities and colleges represented here, largely regional, so there's the theory that people will go more local than they will go further away. And so maybe that's good. All of our universities and colleges represented here are relatively low cost in their higher ed ecosystem. And so that should, in theory, that could also be a boost. And yet there's all sorts of other unknowns. How deep is the recession? How willing are people going to be to spend, even though we're the most affordable options typically in our regions? How willing are they going to engage in that cost? How quickly is the economy going to recover? So are we going to see the countercyclical effect? So I think, we'll know in fall, obviously, and that's not very, very helpful. I just want to underscore, though, you asked the question about how are we planning, and I want to just gloss a point that I think came out of what Anton and Jan were saying a moment ago. What I have seen amongst higher education leadership, whether they're talking about risk mitigation or they're talking about planning for the uncertainties of a fall enrollment, I have seen a higher degree of creativity and innovation, and frankly, nimbleness, which is not a word which is typically associated with our industry. I'm watching universities in my sector who would never have uttered the phrase block program integrate a block program into an otherwise traditional semester. It not just like over the 6-year consultation process that it would typically take, but in a couple of weeks. So it is really, it's, you know, there's a lot of anxiety out there, but higher education is going to be more important now in the future than it ever was in the past, given the economy we're looking at. And I am inspired by, you know, what our faculty and our leadership are doing to sort of make ourselves ready for whatever the world has to throw at us.
Yeah.
So let me build on that from a couple of perspectives. So one, as we all do, we look a lot at our data. We actually created some ad hoc teams and work groups to look back, to do some comparison and contrast with some of the dynamics around the prior recession. Recognizing though, as Dan mentioned, there are a lot of unique pieces within COVID. So the data is important. We know how data goes, right? As you say, is it going to be up double digit or down double digit? So you want to plan for both scenarios. One part of that planning that the KCTCS system certainly believe is very, very, very critical though, is that we hear directly from students. So they did a massive survey with over 10,000 students, really gauging their level of comfort, their concerns, their needs, et cetera. And from that, we developed, with the operative word, a pivot playbook to address that nimbleness, if you will, looking at different scenarios. And you have to really think this thing really through a couple of times in terms of what happens if the pandemic continues, what happens if it resides and then there is a, you know, heaven forbid, another flare-up, or third, the new normal that we keep talking about, or they find a cure between now and December, and we're back to business as usual, right? So there's like 4 different scenarios. So within that playbook, then, which was, again, was a cross-section of all of our areas, academic affairs, business affairs, et cetera, then each entity then did the respective drill downs in terms of how do we best prepare the messaging, you know, what are the sort of factors that we need to consider, and always importantly, how do we communicate it to the unique needs of our students as part of our planning?
First of all, I like that phrase. I'm going to steal that and talk to my board about what we need to do as an organization. Jan, if I could ask you, sort of building on the same theme here, I get asked all the time if we believe that we might see an increase in community college and technical enrollment in the fall. We hear a lot about the students might want to stay closer to home. We know that the impact on the economy and job loss have further diminished people's financial resources, which may make our sector a little more affordable. What are your thoughts, or what are you hearing about those kinds of things?
Well, I think, like, as everybody, you know, as Anton and Dan have said, it's a little, this recession is different from the last one. And so it's a little hard to predict exactly what's going to happen. But you know, we took a look at what happened in the last recession. How did it impact the colleges financially? How did it impact us in terms of our enrollment? And what we saw was, yes, you know, indeed, like everyone else, we had an uptick of 30,000 students, which is about almost a 10% increase in our enrollment during the last recession from unemployed people. But it didn't happen right away. And so what we saw was that the peak of our enrollment was in 2011, and the recession started in 2008. And the reason for that is that people are sorting out, you know, their immediate needs first when they get laid off from a job. And then they think about, wait until they're going to get called back to see if they're going to get called back by their employer. Then their unemployment insurance starts running out, and or other benefits. And then they think, I'm not going to be able to go back to my same employer or even my same occupation. And so then they start thinking about going to college to get an additional credential to be more competitive in a tighter labor market. And so we saw a little bit of a delayed effect from from unemployed people, and that's what we're expecting to see again. So I think one of the challenges for us is that we're going to be arguing to try to stave off budget cuts before the evidence of that demand materializes. And I think that's going to be, we're going to have to talk about what happened in the last recession as the evidence of what we think is going to happen in this recession, because it won't happen immediately. Now, at the same time, we have seen some other interesting things happen. So spring quarter, we saw an uptick in dual credit enrollment. So we have a dual credit program in Washington called Running Start, where high school students, juniors and seniors, can take college classes at their local community or technical college if they pass the placement tests. And so as the K-12 schools closed down, we've been doing online instruction for 20 years. And so I think there was a confidence level in our ability to do online instruction that translated to the high school population. So we saw an interesting increase in the number of high school students. So we're all wondering if that's going to translate into some of the stay closer to home, go to your local college pieces that Dan and Anton were talking about come fall quarter. We do know that dual credit exposure to our colleges encourages students to enroll at our institutions in the fall because they have a positive experience. So that may be a factor. The other thing that is going to be a factor is that all of the universities, and I know, Dan, you're dealing with an entire ecosystem of multiple types of institutions, but all the universities in our state are delaying admissions deadlines, acceptance deadlines. They're delaying signing contracts, housing and dining contracts, and putting down deposits for tuition deadlines. And they are also extending the length of time that they're moving down their wait list. So there's going to be a ripple effect, I think, as the universities change their admissions practices that are going to affect enrollments of young adult students in our institution, in community colleges. And so those two trends are going in opposite directions, the uptick of dual credit and the change in the admission schedules of the universities. And so, who knows? So what we've tried to do is we just got a letter that is co-signed by our state superintendent of public instruction and me, representing the community technical college system, a letter that that colleges and high schools will use to send out to high school students who are graduating with their graduation packets, encouraging them to continue to pursue post-secondary education, letting them know that community colleges are still open for admission and that we would welcome them, their enrollment in our institutions in the fall. We also have been working for the past 4 or 5 months on a Fafsa completion effort, because Washington State has one of the lowest Fafsa completion rates among young adults in the country. And so we launched a pretty large community-based Fafsa completion effort where we went out to community-based organizations and trained people on how to help families fill out the FAFSA, and in an attempt to try to raise our FAFSA completion rates, because our state adopted a change to our state need grant program into an entitlement program. And so we want to communicate broadly to families that if you are low income, you meet the income thresholds, you will get a state grant in addition to a Pell Grant. So, it remains to be seen what the cumulative effect of all of these efforts are for fall quarter, and we're hoping that they will be positive.
Okay, so the panelists are clairvoyant because we're actually starting to nibble around some of the questions from you, our audience. So I'm going to go into those questions. I'm going to start sort of where you led us, Jan, in this issue of dual enrollment. So one of our viewers wanted to know specifically, I guess for you, Dan, and you also, Anton, are you doing anything differently for dual enrollment students that might have been in classrooms but now might have to continue their studies online only?
So the dual enrollment efforts is very, very, very critical, for all of us. Our K-12 coordinators work very closely, obviously, with the K-12 students. And likewise, they, along with the counselors, provide us with a lot of feedback in terms of what some of the obstacles are. So for some of the dual credit students, for example, who are involved in labs, which we saw as one of the challenge areas, particularly if we go back to being fully online. So being able to get a better sense of capacity issues. It may come as a surprise, but some dual credit students make up their minds late in terms of determining, certain courses and pathways, certificates, et cetera, that they plan on following. So being proactive and engaging and getting feedback continuously strikes me as one important thing that we ordinarily do, but we will have to do a lot more, certainly of that. Second, I failed to mention too that by way of geography, our college is considered a rural college. We're at the very far western part of the state. So a challenge for particularly the schools, the K-12 schools in our outer bands, is Wi-Fi access. And so, we are continuously thinking of ways of, right now, 52 miles to one of our campuses, main campus, to get access to Wi-Fi. So we got to figure ways, if you will, of pushing that accessibility further outwards, as yet another example. So there are some unique challenges, both geographically and access points with our K-12, but we do a pretty good job of working collaboratively with our K-12 partners.
Thanks. Dan, what's the word from the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania on that issue?
So, again, there's so much variation. Different institutions serve very different student groups, different needs. Some of them have broadband issues, some of them don't. So I guess the way I think about this, maybe take it more generically, those institutions, one way to achieve social distancing is to have fewer people in face-to-face instruction, which means, okay, so if you're going down that route and you're saying, okay, in this particular scenario, we're going to mitigate risk by enabling social distancing, by narrowing the number of students who are involved in face-to-face, then the question is, okay, which students are and which students are not? And the universities that I'm seeing do this, those that are basically creating a kind of a taxonomy. It's a rank order, and there's always a rationale. But they're making different decisions depending, again, on their community. So some folks are saying, look, first-year students are absolutely critical. That first 6 weeks, let alone the first year, is absolutely critical in retention. Those students are going to be given priority attention with respect to face-to-face instruction. You might include in that group folks who are involved in some form of experiential learning, whether it's internships or whatever, or people involved in lab-based sciences, or people involved in performance arts because of the essential face-to-face nature of the instruction. And so, so where we're thinking about inviting selectively students into face-to-face instruction, those kind of considerations would come into play. Those that are looking at dual enrollment programs, it would be in relation to many of the factors that that Jan and Anton have already referenced. What's their band? What is their band? Are they able to access online in parts of the northern part of the state? The answer would probably be no. So that they may be, and they're critical. They are next year's crop of students for higher ed, if not for my institution. So they may be part of that group that has some preferential access, if that's what I could call it, to online. But I mean, what's interesting, it goes back to really, I mean, this is where these guidelines generally are so important, that they enable a degree of flexibility, because universities and colleges are so different in terms of what they do and where they're located, the infection rates, their access to local healthcare providers, right? So that the one-size-fits-all approach it's not bound to work in a country, in a state as complicated as Pennsylvania, or in a country as complicated as the United States. So this approach allows local decision making within some guardrails, enables this kind of variation, which I think is a good thing.
Okay, one of our other participants has a question, just to build on what we're talking about here, is the issue of student services. What are your thoughts, or what are your plans, or what are you seeing in terms of how would you transition student services, whether it be financial aid registration, student success, counseling, so forth? How do you envision doing these things remotely?
Well, one response would involve, which again, as we have been doing these phases all along, we have looked at different ways of providing those services online to students. So that necessarily wouldn't be a new challenge to us in terms of providing online support resources. So feel pretty confident that certainly we have a good infrastructure in place of meeting most of those needs. I think where it comes, again, a little challenging just with the ebbs and flows with students. Well, not all students and their needs are created equal, right? And so there are those students who may need additional support services. Accessibility is a good example. It takes some finessing, in terms of addressing some of the unique needs of students who may have special needs, as an example. We learn a lot, I'm sure several of my colleagues would attest, through the whole CARES, distribution and support for students, right? Figuring that whole process out in a way in which we communicate and address those financial barriers and things like childcare, transportation, those sort of needs as well. But at the core of it, I would continue to stress, again, maybe as a former communications guy, it's all about, though, that our student services teams, and for that matter, faculty, are consistently being mindful of customizing and not generalizing the services that we provide for students, and gauging. One of the challenges in this format, in many ways, is feedback coming back from students. And so that often takes extra steps. They may take a call. We recently got Signalvine as a text messaging platform to get hopefully more response from students, to get registered, to get advised, et cetera. So I think it's really a combination of those things from my perspective.
I can just add that, let's see, for our colleges, registration has largely been online for quite a while. So I think there are many other student services that are dependent upon somebody coming to you. I mean, coming to the campus and going into the office to get advising, to get support with financial aid, et cetera. And so what our colleges are finding, I think probably not unlike any of the rest of you, is that that the staff are having to be more proactive about reaching out to students. And because they're not on campus for instruction, and to, after class, stop by the student services area to get some assistance. And so the colleges the staff are having to be much more proactive in reaching out and contacting the students themselves instead of waiting for them to come in. And some of our colleges have been, I mean, like you, Dan, I'm just really amazed and impressed by the level of creativity of folks that are across the institutions. And so what some of our colleges have done is that they have redeployed students, work-study students. So when the campus is closed, most of the jobs, the work that the work-study students were doing on campus disappeared. And so rather than laying them off, they were redeployed to do student outreach. And so they were the ones that, the staff would identify the students who they thought would need some extra support. at some institutions, they called every student when they went online to find out if they had online capacity, if they needed hotspots, if they had laptops, et cetera. And they utilized the student workers to help do that outreach. And so I think that the colleges are still doing that as a way of increasing capacity to do that, personal outreach to students. So, I mean, that's not the only solution. Our folks are the student services leads at our institutions have weekly conference calls. The instruction vice presidents have weekly conference calls. And the purpose of those calls is to try to keep everybody up to date as the phased reopening rolls forward in our state. And also as a way for people to talk about common problems and share solutions that they've come up with. And so this idea about student workers started at one college, and then it just spread to the other colleges because everybody thought, what a great idea. So, I think some really interesting things are happening at our institutions.
Yeah,
I would add one other important piece as well too. Prospective students, of course, feeds directly into our enrollment. So some of the, an example of innovation we think that we've done is to host a series of well-publicized Facebook Lives forums where students can talk directly, to our student support services team. And that provides us an opportunity in real time to also gather data from students and at the same time disseminate information. But the recognition that, for the not too distant future, we really got to amp up our social media presence and abilities to engage in that medium.
And I would just add, again, with the focus on ensuring our students' progress while mitigating health and safety risks, you almost start with a lens like, telework where you can, or at least start there. And what's interesting is, because of what happened in March, where we all went remote in 24 hours or 10 days, whatever it was, we had an opportunity to look across a whole range of functions, that had never really been. So there's more, to Anton's point, there's more data, there's more experiential data now to evaluate that proposition about not just, where it makes sense to continue with telework, but where might you actually deliver a capability or a service or whatever, which is as good or better than the one that you were delivering before, in a more face-to-face way. So, to Jan's point, it's been, I don't think any of us necessarily wanted to be in the seething cauldron of innovation for the reason that we find ourselves in it. But to a certain extent, we're in a seething cauldron of innovation, which I think is going to have, I want to be optimistic. I think it's going to have long-term positive impacts on our ability to serve, in the same historic, with the same historic mission, but to do it even better. I want to believe that.
Yeah, I would just say that leaders are often tasked with things not of their own choosing.
Right.
But keeping with the topic, we had another question I think is relevant at this moment, which is in terms of moving remotely and transitioning student services, what about the issue of doing sort of technology audits with students to ascertain what kind of capability they may have? And then I've also heard that a lot of our colleges, have purchased laptops or provided laptops to students. Can any of you maybe comment on that as well?
Well, we certainly have purchased a number of laptops, again, because of our rural Wi-Fi access issues. So we were already in that process and had to expand that and develop a process to getting those to students. The technology audit is also one that we've been talking about quite a bit about, particularly as we think, we haven't really talked much about workforce and workforce training, but certainly the preparation level of our students and building that confidence with employers that we are the front lines, if you will, with regards to being ready and having students ready. And so, that pathway to the certification or workforce solutions training, I think all of that interplays with the whole notion of that inventory as well.
Others, Dan or Jan, in terms of these technology audits or providing digital capability to students?
Well, I think across state government, the whole issue of the digital divide and, broadband deserts in different parts of the state have become so much more visible because higher ed isn't the only service that moved online. All state government services moved online. And so, for people to access applying for unemployment insurance or TANF or, SNAP food benefits, all of that stuff has been moved online. And all of those offices are closed. So if you don't have access to broadband, and in the case for higher education, it has to be high-speed internet if you really want to be able to participate fully in an online class. So those are, we can buy laptops, we can buy hotspots, but if the broadband does not exist in somebody's community, in their neighborhood, then there isn't much we can do about that. And so that has really been a struggle, I think. And I think the share of students who are in that situation has surprised everyone in our institutions. They knew it existed, but the extent to which it existed has become much more visible now as the institutions have moved everything online. And so, for the first time, we're part of a conversation with the state broadband office about how do we fill those gaps in those deserts. And so communities are coming up with different solutions, but our colleges are, extending broadband out to their parking lots so that people, instead of driving to campus to take a classroom-based class, they can drive to campus and sit in the parking lot and do their online class, but they can also apply for unemployment benefits online and other kinds of online services. So that's not a good solution, in the rural communities like yours, Anton, where you cover a big geographic area and your campus is far away from a lot of communities, but it's what we can contribute to help solving the problem. But I do think the whole piece about broadband is an equity issue that has to be solved.
Let's cover a little, if we can, another 30 seconds if we will, Jan. So let's cover for a second with the equity issues as well too. So I think it's also important then that, you have the general challenges rural, certainly. We talked quite a bit about looking in comparison to the prior recession. We look at our data, we see that 55% of females took the advantage versus 45% of males. But the drill down within African American and Hispanic students and Asian students is significantly lower. Generalizing, of course, some of our, in this area particularly, the African American population and Hispanic are the two dominant populations. Access points then becomes the local libraries, the churches, some of the after school groups. Well, with all things COVID, the access points there are further challenged. So I just want to put that into the mix as well. So we've got to be very intentional and creative too in how we communicate and spur some degree of, confidence and, collaboration in terms of those who have access to those populations to help us somehow to keep that message that ultimately still the answer is coming back to school, getting trained, right, coming out of COVID.
And just to build on that, it's true. In the pandemic has demonstrated, with respect to health outcomes, that the significant inequalities that exist across different populations. The same harsh spotlight has been shined on education, on higher education in particular, and just shows gross, actually stark inequalities that we all know about. But now they make a difference in a way. They've always made a difference. It's always not been, in my view, acceptable. But it's increasingly, stark and it's apparent. and whether you're talking about rural populations who don't have broadband access, or, you know, when we went remote in March and, you know, we had to vacate our dorms and residence halls, and there were students, hundreds of students who had no place to go, right? Or whether you're talking about, you know, the ability of institutions, you know, depending on how much liquidity they have, depending on how much reserves they have or endowment they have, can respond very differently to this pandemic than institutions like the ones represented here. And what's troubling to me is that the majority of students who have been from historically underserved populations, whether, you know, students of color, low-income students, rural students, tend to go disproportionately to institutions that have the least capability of managing through this transition in a way that gives their students the widest range of options. So the impacts potentially on our ability to correct for the kind of growing inequality in this country are in the longer term. They're very, very challenging.
Yeah.
Sorry to be a Debbie Downer on that last bit.
Well, I don't think you're being a Debbie Downer. I think you're talking the truth here. These are very important things that we are going to have to contend with. Unfortunately, while we've been having a great time, time has passed and we've reached the end of our time. And I think this is as good a note to end on as any other. I want to first start by thanking my distinguished panelists, Dan, Anton, and Jen. I want to thank you very much for spending the hour with me here up on the cloud, wherever that is. I will also say that doing this remotely has its challenges. You might have observed I was on mute a lot of the time because my next door neighbor decided to mow his lawn and operate his leaf blower. So I'm hoping that none of you heard that. But I want to thank you again for being here and participating. I want to remind our viewers that there'll be a link to the recording of this session. It will be emailed to all of you and you'll have the opportunity to review this. We'll also post this on the Education Strategy Group website. I think also ACCT and probably SHIO will be doing the same on our website. So I invite you to revisit this and take advantage of the content. And lastly, because we've done 3 of these now, and I think we've had some good reviews, we're planning another series of these webinars, and I would like to ask our viewers to put a hold on June 25th at 3 p.m. Eastern Time for our next webinar, which we hope will be focused on reskilling displaced workers. So from my broadcast studio here in Bethesda, Maryland, I want to thank again our panelists. I want to thank Matt Gandel from the Education Strategy Group and Rob Anderson from the State Higher Education Executive Officers and the great team behind us that made this possible. So stay safe, stay healthy. We'll see you soon. Bye-bye.
Thanks, man.
Bye.